whether that's fire or drought or changes in grazing or logging. And I'm also really interested in restoration. And as probably everybody in this room knows, there's a lot of disturbance and a lot of need in this area. And there's also a lot of amazing restoration work being done. And so a lot of the work that I do is thinking about how can research, how can our theories in ecology and our ideas in ecology kind of learn from restoration projects or disturbances that are happening, but also then hopefully provide useful information to feed back into some of that work. So as Rachel pointed out, I'm sorry I gave you a title with a lot of big words in it, but I promise we'll talk about all of them tonight, and hopefully it won't feel like a scary title by the end of the talk. All right, so as an ecologist, again, my big picture question is thinking about how disturbances affect the interactions between species, what sort of species regenerate in plant community systems. And especially in diverse systems where there's a lot of complicated things going on. And of particular interest to me is the fact that we live in a world that varies year to year. Things are happening, droughts are happening, mass years are happening, insects are happening. And so every year is a little bit different if you're a plant. And so thinking about how that variability, especially year to year, changes this dynamic of disturbance impacts on plant communities. So I'm going to be talking about that today, highlighting two different types of variation in time that I think about and some of those mechanisms. I also think about variation in space. And so if that's something that you're excited about, I'd be happy to chat about that later. So one of the things I think about is how the year that a disturbance happens matters. So what happens if it's a drought year? What happens if it's not? And the fancy word for that is year effects. The other thing I think about is how does the order of when species arrive impact plant communities and regeneration after disturbance? And our fancy term for that is priority effects. So we'll spend some time unpacking those. And then as a lot of you probably think about, this isn't just a one-way arrow, right? So the vegetation that is there often then affects things like our fire regime or what restoration work needs to be done or what the drought impacts are. So we think about this cycling as well. But we're going to start with a really, really beautiful project. I had an opportunity, the very first independent research project I ever did was working on the Elwha Dam removal. I had an incredible opportunity with a lot of options, and so I cold called somebody at the National Park Service, and I said, I have a summer, and I want to come do research with you. I want to help bring a research component to the revegetation work that's going on. I spent a lot of time in Northwest Washington. I was really, really excited about this dam removal project. And they said, yeah, sure, come work for us for free. We can handle that. And so I did. On the Elwha watershed is primarily located within Olympic National Park in Northwest Washington. It's a really beautiful space, also very diverse, but not impacted by a lot of the land use changes that we might see everywhere else. So because it's in the national park, sorry, I wander, you're gonna get what you get. Because it's in the national park, it was a really incredible place to think about how this regeneration works. So what happens with dam removal projects like this one, like the one on the Klamath, is they're often motivated by habitat needs for the fish, for the salmon in particular. But when you remove these large dams and these impediments, you have an area that was a lake for 100 years and is now not. So when we think about community assembly and how species arrive and how they interact with each other, this is this amazing opportunity because there's thousands of acres that are suddenly available for plants. So on the Elwha, there were two different reservoirs, Aldwell and Mills. And Mills in particular was pretty large. And so the first time I saw it, it looked like this. And this is about half of the reservoir. The rest of it goes around the corner. And to give you a sense of scale, this is zoomed in. These are people here, and there's my people. So there's really big logs up in the Pacific Northwest. So these are big spaces, and so understanding these mechanisms of recovery, what sort of species come back, how and when do they come back, is really interesting across these systems. So this is kind of, again, it's that large scale space, but it's also this corridor around this riparian area. And the interesting things in this system is there's not necessarily a plant community you can point to and say it should look like that right now. Because surrounding it is relatively old conifer forest. And along the floodplain, we would expect a disturbed riparian ecosystem, but those soils aren't necessarily ready for conifer trees to come straight in, but they're not necessarily floodplain areas either. So it's really an opportunity to look at, like, what does ecosystem assembly in this kind of setting look like? And it's really fun to watch this process happen. So getting to be involved in something like this, we see a lot of the same dynamics that have been tracked over decades, somewhere like Mount St. Helens, where on that volcanic soil, there's been slow recruitment of different communities and processes. But because the soil is richer, has more organic matter, is easier to grow on, these processes happen a lot more quickly. So we get to observe processes like, this is a dense, mostly alder stand, and they're all growing up. And here's all the little brown ones that didn't make it. They got shaded out, right? So we've got thinning happening in these stands. It's the ones that can't reach the light die. And then 2 years later, you have this lie down process where all of the ones that only grew straight up to reach the light aren't actually strong enough to support themselves anymore, and they fall over, and you get another round of thinning as well. And so it's just, I mean, as an ecologist, it's so fun to watch this happen in real time. Like, go back in 2 years and be like, oh, now they're doing this stage that we've already got into space. And then we also see some really incredible components of facilitation, especially in the areas which are more this like coarse gravel, hard to grow in. This was where a lot of the active restoration work was done, because there just wasn't a lot that was easily colonizing. It was kind of hard for seeds to get started in this space. And one of the things they found was that when they brought in lupin, which is a nitrogen fixer, is a hardy pioneer plant, suddenly everything else was taking off as well. So this is the same area a few years later, and that lupin is holding the space, it's holding the soil down, it's bringing in some of that nitrogen, then it starts decomposing, there's more organic matter. And these little conifers, which were planted in the first year, but they just kind of hung out tiny and scrawny for a really long time, now they're suddenly like, oh, okay, we can do this, right? This is workable. So this is a community which has a lot of these like textbook predictable successional processes. But my questions are all about, well, what about the variation? What's the messiness in this, right? Where does that come in? And so thinking about in this kind of community, are those stochastic factors, those things that aren't directly predictable, are they still happening? And we did find a couple of them. So one of them was that seasonal timing and microhabitats were really important. So this is cottonwood, and cottonwood can grow in a range of habitats, but its seeds only germinate when they hit really nice wet soil. And so throughout the reservoir, there were all of these little bands of cottonwood, which is where the drawdown of the water happened to happen at just the right timing for that cottonwood seed release. And those areas were just wet enough. And the area right above it, it was a little too dry when the cottonwoods came. And the area right below, it was inundated a little too long. And so you got these different bands throughout the years of these cottonwoods that then were very, very dense and very, very healthy. And they're there again, still like 8 years later, doing quite well, but they had that opportunity to establish. The other thing I did, the main part of my project was looking at, with this different drawdown timing, there was kind of a large hold because of sediment levels in the water. It wasn't planned. It was just like, our filtration systems can only handle so much. So they did a whole bunch of drawdown and then they paused. And then almost a year later, they did the rest of the drawdown. And so I actually targeted plots above that drawdown line and below that drawdown line to say, assuming all else is mostly equal, what's just that impact of exposure timing, the 1 year versus the other? And I'm not going to give you all the plant data, but I will give you, this is like the big picture summary figure. And this one's a little weird, but we're taking all of the species data that we have, which is dozens and dozens of different species, and we're kind of smushing it together onto 2 axes. So what's that variation of those 2 axes? And I've got my 2 reservoirs on there. I did 2 years of sampling, but even just focusing on this one, these are the plots that were exposed with that earlier drawdown timing, and these were the plots that were exposed with the later drawdown timing. And these are all native dominated. They're all the kinds of species you'd expect, but we end up with different suites of species and different abundances of species just to be based on when that timing was. So there's a statistically significant difference, both when we originally sampled and then 2 years later when we went back and resampled it, on what kind of communities we get.
Were you assuming the substrates were physically identical?
Yes, so all of this was kind of on the valley wall as opposed to down on the bottom where we're seeing the lupins and stuff like that. I do also have soil sample data. We did a bunch of soil sampling to show like that chemically and physically they were mostly the same. Yeah. But that was the assumption. And because this transition picture is really cool, I like to show it off. So again, this is Mills as drawdown was just about finished. That's in 2015. And this is in 2022. And so again, this is all of the recruiting, mostly riparian and early successional vegetation. And this is where you get the facilitation by the lupins and other stuff coming in as well. All right, so there's this impact of when soil gets exposed. And so a lot of that then motivated my questions of like, well, what is that impact? Where does it come from? What are the mechanisms driving this kind of thing? And this is where the question about year effects comes in. So if we think of a community and it's doing something through time, we could look at one community and we could sample it through time about what's going on year to year. In this case, we're saying if you initiated that community, if you made that soil available or started that restoration project in this year versus that year, does that actually result in different trajectories? Does that result in different communities? And this is a lot of the motivating question of my work. So I worked on an experiment that was set up to test this. It was established at 3 different sites in grasslands. It manipulated a bunch of different things, but the biggest thing was they set up the identical experiment across these 3 sites every time for 5 years. So all of the plots, all of the blocks across all 3 sites, exact same treatments, 5 years in a row to look at, do we actually get the same results if you run the experiment in different years? And what's the impact of the year? And so analysis a whole bunch of time later, kind of summing across all of the things and all the data we collected, was it absolutely the biggest factor, more than site where we had a gradient in rainfall, more than even some of the treatments we were running, was which year they ran the experiment in, was the biggest predictor of some of our like plant cover. And so the planning year is really important for community. But then we started to think about, like, well, what does that mean? Now we've got all of these plots that are set up across 5 different years, and some of them are really different from each other. So what's the like bigger landscape scale impact of that? I'm going to take a little time to talk you through this one as well, but this was the follow-up paper then that came out of that, which was, given that we have all these plots started in different years, what does that mean for the bigger scale diversity of this system? And what we found, and we took a subset of this data and with native annual grasses, again, across 3 sites across 5 years. And because of that variation among years, again, all of our species switched on the 2 axes. This is, you would draw a very big circle. We've got a lot of differences among our plots. So the beta diversity and the overall diversity in the system is really different with our perennial species compared to what we would get if we only planted in 1 year. Kind of not surprisingly, but it was really interesting to show how dramatically the plots that we planted only with annuals, you don't see that because they're changing year to year. So we've got that turnover change. It matters less. This was like by 8 years later. So by 8 years later, it matters less what year you started them. But for the perennials where that reestablishment really matters, it really actually 8 years later still mattered what year they started. And so as we're thinking about, whether it's restoration projects or how we think about diversity on our landscape, the fact that all of these disturbances or all of these projects are happening at different times can actually equate to variety, right? And diversity in a way that if we did a big field all at once, we wouldn't get. Yeah, Dave.
So in those 5 years, does anything spit out as a big variation from 1 year to the other year?
I'll get into that a little bit. One of the things we found when where we dig into this is like every time we think we know what it was and we go manipulate that thing, the answer is that thing matters, but something else clearly seems to matter too. So usually in California grasslands, we're assuming it's rainfall and precipitation. So this project actually has a whole sub-project where they watered half of their plots. And that wasn't it. That wasn't the big variation. There's another project with a collaborator that I didn't work on, but as a collaborator of mine on other projects, and one of her dissertation chapters, they did the same thing in tallgrass prairie. They're like, we know water is really important, so they did a drought treatment and they did a watering treatment and they found big treatment effects, and they ran it in 3 years, and every year was different, and the treatment, it wasn't different in the way that the treatment would have predicted. And so I think part of the answer is like, it's often like the timing of the precipitation, right? It's one of those things that like, if you're doing the work on the ground, you can look back, or if you spend a lot of time in a system, you can say, oh, that was the year we got that really big rain event right at the right timing in spring. And so this thing came up more than that thing, right? I think a lot of us work on projects where you're like, okay, like that was probably the big factor, or there was a big rain event, but then it was followed by a cold snap, or it was followed by a heat spell. And so more kind of the zooming out the big picture is because some of those nuances really matter in different ways for different plants. When you're planting a community, it's often then not just one factor that matters. Does that help? Yeah,
Sure.
start getting that question.
Was
Yeah.
all this planting seeds as opposed to seedlings?
This is seeds. This is grass seeds. So perennial grass seeds and annual grass seeds. Yeah.
Naively, I think that when there's year-round precipitation, like in the Midwest or tallgrass prairies, that there'd be maybe less year-to-year variation for precipitation as opposed to a Mediterranean climate where clearly summer water stress is a big deal.
Yeah.
But you said that.
But so one of the other labs that spends a lot of time and thought working on this is in tallgrass prairie, and they get a lot of these really strong year-to-year effects as well. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so stepping out of grasslands for a minute, bringing this to another system. So this was a project I did for my dissertation in the Sierra Nevada. And 2015 was sort of towards the tail end of a really bad drought. So these pictures are all taken at the same point, satellite pictures in March. Here's our snowpack in 2015. Here it is in 2016. And then we had a really wet, big snow year in 2017. And so when we're talking about some of these year effects and the fact that like plant communities exist in this variable world, you can imagine that if you have a fire that's followed by this year, you might expect really different dynamics than if you have a fire followed by this year. And really important ones for them. What's the recruitment after fire? Do we need to do post-fire restoration? How are species interacting with each other? So I worked on a couple projects to look at that. One of them was a really large-scale field data collection that I collaborated on. This was across over 500 plots in 19 different fires, with crews going out and surveying where are conifer seedlings coming up in high severity burn areas, where are they not coming up, right? Where do we have recruitment success and where do we have recruitment failure? And how much is that impacted by whether that fire is followed by a drought year or not? That's our question. What we found was that for some things, it really matters. So all of these graphs are how bad was the drought after fire? So was it not really followed by droughty years or was it followed by quite droughty years? And then some of them we also looked at, well, for that site, would it be normally be a pretty wet site, or would it normally be a pretty dry site? And we looked at this for a bunch of different groups of species. Interestingly, our most common species, the one that we were really looking for the recruitment of, which was our yellow pine, ponderosa pine, and Jeffrey pine, it doesn't care. There's other things that predict pine recruitment. Mostly where there are adults that are putting out seeds, you get trees. And if there's not adults putting out seeds, you don't get trees. But we thought it would be affected by drought. We thought it would be affected by how much precipitation there normally was. We had a whole bunch of data going into this. Pines, not so much. White fir, which is less drought tolerant as an adult, but also apparently less drought tolerant as a seedling, much more so. So white fir really only showed up in areas that were normally more wet. And if it was followed by wetter years, it did better than if it was followed by droughty years. We get the opposite pattern in shrubs and grasses. They do better if there's a droughty. They're more likely to be present in plots. And I like thinking about species, how species interact. So my next question was then, well, is this driving that? Or is it maybe the other way around, but these trees aren't very big yet. This is like 3 to 5 years post-fire. Are these actually just correlations, or do we actually have things interacting with each other? And that's why they like it post-fire. Or that's why, maybe that's why droughts are really affecting our conifers. So as any good ecologist at some point does, I decided to mess with things. And I decided to do that by becoming a little bit of an engineer and spending a massive amount of time at Home Depot, because I wanted to create drought, but I was working in the Sierra Nevadas where there was snow. So these are my PVC pipe and chicken wire and plastic sheeting shelters to reduce snow impact on my plots. There's trenches around every single one of these. I've got 16 of them in each of my treatments. But trenches to move the snow so that when it melts, it's not all just melting back into the plot. Yeah, and they actually stayed up for 3 years, which is pretty amazing. And then within those plots, I also either did like a cut and herbicide treatment to remove the shrubs out of the plots, or I let the shrubs regenerate and recruit naturally. And then because I could, I started this experiment. I did planting in 2 different years. One of those was 2016. I was working in the King Fire, which was one of the early, like, high severity, everything burns all at once mega fires in California. So 2016, which is the first year post-fire, and then 2017, which if you remember from my pictures, was the one where we just got dumped on by. And I did end up looking at this at our 2 different main species in this area. The yellow pine, Pinus ponderosa, and the white fir, Aves concolor. And then we looked at, so I had seeded all of these and I marked them with toothpicks, and I collected a whole bunch of data on how many of them emerge, how long do they live, what's our total regeneration rate, things like that. So I'm going to show you a little bit of that data. But we have all of these different treatments. So we're going to start just looking at the white fir and thinking about if you have shrubs present, or if you don't have shrubs, how do they do? And the white fir actually, if anything, did a little bit better when we had a little less snowpack, which seems strange. I didn't think they'd really like it droughty. They didn't really seem to mind so much about the shrubs. Again, they're known as being one of our more shade tolerant species. White fir comes up in the subcanopy and can handle that for a while. So seems to make a decent amount of sense. The pines, on the other hand, had this really interesting pattern where their reactions to the shrubs was dependent on how much snowpack they had. So the ones who got the normal amount of snow did much better if there weren't shrubs than if there were. The ones that were subjected to this drought treatment actually did about the same if they were under shrubs. And we spent a bunch of time looking at this and thinking about this, because it kind of goes against this idea that everybody's competing for water, and shouldn't we be competing more strongly when there's drought and less water to go around? But one of the big things that happens in this site, because it's this high severity burn, is the top of the soil is incredibly black for the first couple of years. I mean, if anybody's worked in a post-fire system, you get home and you're like, you showered 3 times and you're still all smeared out black, right? And that means it gets really hot. And so if you're drought stressed, you're also more susceptible to getting heat killed when you're a teeny tiny seedling. And so these ones kind of have this net effect, or maybe they're competing more for water, maybe they're not, but they're also getting a little bit of a shading effect from the shrubs, and it seems to matter more in that condition. So that was really cool. It was really exciting. We had this project going. I had it all set up. So I was like, okay, I'm going to plant out a second set of seeds and see what happens next year. See if we get these same patterns. And this was the year where we got dumped on snow. So I was like, I bet we might see really different things. We did. But mostly what we saw was everything died. And everything died because this was this incredibly extreme year where we got all this dumped on snow, and the snow should have been good and there should have been water. And then the summer was blisteringly hot, and the seedlings just pretty much all got heat. So some of them survived because we had some survival duration, but much less impact of, we had impacts of the snowpack on like whether they emerged. So they actually emerged earlier and more frequently if we reduced the snow because they weren't sitting under that big layer of snow for quite so long. But then it got really hot. That was the impact. So again, kind of leading to that, like we think some of these year effects are about drought, but maybe they're not about drought, maybe they're about heat. And similarly, oftentimes if you talk to foresters working in the system, it's like, well, the shrubs are bad for the trees because they're competing for water and competing for light. And that may be true in some settings, but there's also a lot of circumstances, especially in some of these extreme conditions, where it's probably a trade-off. The trees aren't growing as well, but they might be more likely to survive when they've got that shading effect. All right, so we've got these, so hopefully you're along with me for the ride. We've got these potentially big impacts on timing of like who recruits in year 1, right? Who shows up right away? What happens with that community or what happens with that species? But that only, I mean, it's interesting in the short term, but to most people, it only matters if it actually has lasting impacts. Like if we have this initial difference, but then 2 years later, everybody can recruit in, then maybe it doesn't matter so much. And so the other piece of this that I think about a lot that ties in really closely is called priority effects. And it's the idea that kind of whoever arrives first maybe gets a head start. So you could have all of the same species arrive in a community, but if these ones show up first, they probably have an advantage. And if those ones show up first, they probably have an advantage. Priority effects can go all sorts of different directions. They can get more complicated. We can think about like, well, what if these are lupins and they're nitrogen fixers? They end up facilitating those guys. But this is kind of the simplest version of it, which is showing up first probably gives you an advantage. Lets you take up space, lets you access resources first. Some plants have plant soil feedbacks that benefit them. So lots of different mechanisms. And where I get interested in this with restoration as well is it gets kind of out of this conceptual component, although it's interesting for understanding ecological mechanisms. But there's a lot of things we can't manipulate in restoration. We can often manipulate this, right? So if we're weeding, we're saying, slow down these ones, we're going to show ours up first, right? If we're seeding, we're saying, let's get these ones out now before these guys show up. Maybe we can't stop them from showing up, but maybe we can weed for 1 year and give them a head start. And so understanding these mechanisms actually helps predict like when restoration is likely to be successful or what the ways are that restoration actions can be successful. So I'm going to go back to that project that I've showed you little snippets of when we planted all of these different species across 5 years across 3 sites. This was actually kind of the middle parts of the treatment, which I haven't shown you out yet. But this was the project, which is We're gonna plant only native species. We're gonna plant seed only our non-natives. These are our grasses. So native perennial grasses, non-native annual grasses. Put them in at the same time, see what happens, how they all compete with each other. Or what if we give the natives 1 year advantage? That's the like drawdown timing, where I went out and weeded really intensely for a year time. Or what if we just give them a 2-week advantage? So like we put them out and watered them a little bit right before the season started, so they get a head start. That's a very common restoration thing. Or, you know, sometimes 2-week priority, you can even think about like, well, what about the species that just germinate early on their own? So this is 1 year later. This is the cover of our native species. If you plant the natives together with the non-natives, they lose. They're not there, right? They're very barely there. If you give them a 1 year advantage, they're about as good as if you put them on their own. What really cool is even if you just give them 2 weeks, they're doing pretty darn good. But this is 1 year later. And we know a lot of restoration projects, often the challenge is that we do something, we do it for a year, and it's hard to know what happens long term. So that's where a lot of the research can come in, is like, what does that long-term trajectory look like? So we actually followed this project for 8 years. And we're gonna jump ahead to 2019 because these graphs all look pretty much the same. But here we are, this is our simultaneous planting where they show up at the same time. Again, these are native perennials, so they take a little while to establish. So they're actually kind of holding their own, right? They're doing better than they started. But we've only got about 20% cover when we put them down at the same time versus 45–50% cover when they don't come on their own. The ones that got a 1 year head start back in 2011, they're still doing exactly as well as the ones where the non-natives never showed up. Okay. That year to hold that space, to optimize those resources, to grow big and quick a little bit quickly, it has a huge impact on the species. And then really interesting and exciting and surprising to us was like a 2-week difference 8 years later still has a really big impact. We're still about halfway in between if they showed up and we've done nothing. And so, you know, I don't know that this applies to everything. Again, these are native perennials and non-native annuals. So there's some very specific patterns going on, but that's common in a lot of grassland restorations that we work on across the West, that we have native perennial grasses that you're trying to get established. And so this is where I start getting really excited about some of those timing mechanisms and what consequences they could have for our landscape. With this too, the flip side of this is, well, what's going on with the non-natives that we seeded? And so we do see in these native priority treatments, a somewhat reduced cover of the natives. Although these ones actually, it sticks around for quite a while and then they start dropping out because there were like one extra species that was not one of the natives that we seeded that started kind of invading in its own wave. And it was actually out competing these non-natives. So we've got its cover data as well, but that's why this one started dropping. But even with that other one coming and competing again, the natives are still holding their own just from that little bit of advantage. So this is really cool. We've got natives establishing, but one of the challenges in restoration projects, especially in these California grasslands, is they're not just grasslands, they're also prairies. And so people will often focus on planting, for example, perennial bunch grasses, or sometimes like a perennial like lupin that can hold the space where this kind of thing is going to work because it works. And that's what we're trying to do, is get native cover. But sometimes then you just get 1 or 2 species which work really well, but not necessarily the full suite of diversity that you might like. So this next project doesn't quite get to diversity. But starts to think about how could we use some of these things in restoration, not just to prioritize native species, but to try to increase that success and diversity in our native species assemblages. So I worked on a different priority experiment project. This was one where we were planting just native species, but native grasses, a suite of native grasses and a suite of native forbs. And those native forbs included a couple that were really dominant, including a lupin that would just establish. So if you plant them both at the same time, you just get the forbs. And the grasses kind of disappear in the first couple of years. And so the question was, well, what if you give the grasses a little time to establish first? If you give them a year, do we end up with still just our forbs? Do we flip the thing and end up with just our grasses? Or can we actually get more diversity out of this project, more native diversity? So we did this again. Really excited to be able to run this experiment for 8 years. This was actually a fun project I joined on about here in grad school because this intermittent between year 3 and 8, my PI forgot that he was paying for the field that this project was set up on. So we had 3 years of data, and then he was like, oh shoot, this is still here. Anybody want to go dig out some plots and collect some more data? And so because of that, we managed to get one of the longest running priority data sets at the time. So that was great. That worked out really well. And a lot of it was trying to like relocate and refine all of these plots, and then collect this cover data. So similar experiment to what you've seen before, native grasses, native forbs. If you just plant grasses, you get grasses. If you just plant forbs, you don't get grasses. If you just plant forbs, you get forbs, right? If you plant them together at the same time, I already gave you this punchline, but in this particular case, we were only getting the forbs and only like a tiny bit of the grass cover. And so this question is, what if we change up the timing? What happens if the grasses come a year earlier? What happens if the forbs come a year earlier? And here's what you get. If you give the grasses an advantage, you don't get quite as much grass cover as you would have before, but you get quite a lot of it more than if you put them in together. And you still get some decent forb cover. If you give the forbs an advantage, they still do really well because they do really well. And so there's ways we can think about, even in incredibly manipulative systems, taking these sort of theoretical ecological concepts and thinking about how do we use them to understand our world, but also how do we use them to make some really practical changes. So yeah.
When you planted the grasses first, and then the forbs a year later, did you weed it for the first year to keep the space empty? Or was that space colonized by whoever came along?
This one we weeded for the first 2.5 years, and then they forgot we had it. And at that point, whatever was there for the next 5, and this is year 8. Yeah. Great question. Yeah.
So what would you expect for a climax community if this went on for 50 years? Would you stay with forbs in one and stay with grasses in another? That doesn't seem intuitive.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it was honestly very surprising to me. One of the reasons we did this work and we found all these plots was I wanted to see like who's moving around and what are the spreads to different places. And mostly they were staying where we put them. I mean, these were 2 meter by 2 meter plots. Again, these were mostly perennial species, so that's a little bit different. I don't know that I would consider it a climax community, but I would say like these plots are abandoned agricultural lands that are now being used for research. So kind of a common restoration setting. They're close to a road, right? They've got some of those impacts. But historically, they would have been old growth grasslands, old growth prairies. Stipa, one of the dominant grasses in this mix, can get 50 to 100 years old. And so to a certain, and a lot of how they do that, like our trees, is by having incredibly high survival as adults, but not a lot of recruitments as from seedlings. So you do get seedlings, you do get new ones. But even in extreme drought conditions, Stipa will survive 97% of the time. We know that from other studies. So yeah, so these are the trees of the grass world, and they do tend to stay where they start. And so a lot of, I think, what a climax community looks like is then kind of what comes in and shifts and moves around them, the same way that like an understory might change in some of our old growth places. All right, I wanted to end by sharing a few of the things that I'm excited to be starting on working on here now that I'm in Southern Oregon. I don't have results from any of that for you, but just kind of ideas of projects and things that I'm hoping in future years I can come share and present. So the first one, the big one that grabs everybody's attention is I was very excited. Not only was this amazing, I'd worked on the world's largest dam removal, and then I got to come here right as it was being trumped by the world's largest dam removal. And even more exciting, the person I collaborated with on the Elwha is the person who is leading the Yurok tribe revegetation and monitoring crews here on the Klamath. So it was very fun to come and see an old friend and jump into that collaboration. So I've had the incredible opportunity this past summer. I went out with 2 researchers funded by SOU's STEM Rex program for research experience for undergrads. And it was first year of drawdown, a lot of shifting, there's a lot of changing restoration work and plans. And so a lot of this was just like, what does baseline data look like? What's coming up in the areas that have been seeded and planted and restored? If you didn't get to go out there in May or early June, I would recommend it. It's gorgeous. Especially all along the edges, the blooms of the poppies and the lupins, the butterflies and grasshoppers, the insect diversity is wild. You can walk through spaces and like, I'm not a huge insect ID person, but I can still tell that there are dozens of different species out there without even getting into some of the it's really patchy, it's really interesting. There's a lot of work and changes that are being made this year, so it'll be interesting to see how that affects what's coming up. But very, very different setting than the Elwha, which has been fun. So similar projects, similar questions, but much more of our, it's a semi-high desert, mixed chaparral, oaks, like what should be there, kind of is very patchy on the landscape. A lot more human impact, a lot more drought impact, a lot more pressure for the invasive species, some of which are already present in the seed bank, some of which are coming in sort of through wind, some of which are being tracked in by people and horses, and to a lesser extent cattle. And so the dynamics are very different. So it'd be interesting to see how species interactions look and how some of these things play out in the system. I have an ongoing project in Northern California. Looking at these grasses. This was Stipo, which I was talking about. This is what it looks like as a 1.5-year-old. This is it's kind of intermixed here, but it's in here as a 4-year-old grass. So the miniature start of an old growth grassland. And getting to work on this project through UC Extension, where they have these really large scale rainout shelters. So trying to manipulate drought on a bigger scale and understand what it's doing on these plots. And planting stipa with avena, which is one of our really common non-native grasses throughout California, Oregon, Pacific Northwest, and looking at how the dynamics between this annual species and the perennial species are shaped with drought, and how drought changes through time. And had the opportunity, I brought down, actually a few more than this, but quite a few student researchers to come work on that project and help collect different. So excited. We wrapped that one up actually completely last summer. So just getting into the analyses and understanding all of what we can learn from the 3 years of data we collected. And the last project that I have that's running is working with Scott River Watershed Council, where they are working on restoring mountain meadows in Klamath National Forest. These are really beautiful mountain meadows with fens and gorgeous Darlingtonia patches, which is our endemic pitcher plant. They're highly diverse. They're really important for water resources, since they're a water storage, basically, similar to how snowpack is. And one that's likely to become increasingly important as our snow is melting earlier or coming less as snow. There's these beautiful mountain streams, but they're also been heavily impacted by cattle, open range cattle grazing, conifer encroachment. And so they're absolutely gorgeous as is, but there's also a lot of work and a lot of restoration to be done. So we've been partnering with them as they're doing that work on a couple of different questions. One is quantifying some of the impacts of the cattle in the meadow, how those vary between some of the drier meadow locations versus these wet Darlingtonia fens. And I have a student then who's also planning a capstone for this summer, to start mapping like where cattle impacts are densest and what types of impacts are happening in different spaces. And then we're also working here in the SOU greenhouse right outside to understand what species might be present but not visible in the system. So especially places where we have conifer encroachment, where we don't see meadow species anymore, are they actually there as seeds in the seed bank waiting for the right hydrological conditions to pop up? Or would they need to slowly spread out from these meadow patches or be brought in? So that helps, especially if they're thinking about thinning, as they're thinking about thinning some of these conifer trees. These are all native trees, they're really beautiful trees, but they're impacting this meadow. And so there's a trade-off there. And so if we have a sense, but the better we can get a sense of what will recruit and how quickly, if that work gets done, that kind of helps inform some of those decisions. So 3 students who worked on this with me last year on their capstone. There's 3 more who have taken it over since they've graduated. And so we're collecting soil samples within meadows and outside of meadows, and putting them in the greenhouse and keeping them as wet and meadowy as we can without them getting taken over by algae, and seeing what germinates, seeing what comes out. And we're starting to see things coming out of some of those like historical meadow sites that aren't present right now in the above ground vegetation community. So that's really fun. That's a lot of the stuff I spend time for in the herbarium is like, great, we found a sedge and I think I've keyed it out, and now I'm gonna go pull up all my options in the herbarium and see if that actually makes sense in references. So hugely grateful to have that resource on campus for myself and students. And it's a fun and beautiful and very green space in winter if you ever need a little bit of warm break. So that's all I'm talking about today. I've worked on many things in many systems. So if you're interested in talking about not just what happens if you have drought after a fire, but what happens if the drought comes before the fire, and scrub regeneration in California chaparral, I'm interested in that. Like I said, I'm interested in questions of space and how things vary across space as well, especially with fire and fire resilience. I've worked on projects in California, Sierra Nevada, as well as one project in Kenya looking at that. And then a lot of my work is actually also modeling focused and all on the computer. So what do? We can measure some of these things. We can mess with things with 2 species or with 4 species assemblages. How do we start building models that scale up to more diverse communities? So happy to chat about any of that as well if you're interested. But thank you so much for your time, for your attention. Again, huge shout outs to all of the students who have worked and continue to work with me on all of these projects. And thanks to funders and sponsors. I'm happy to take any and all questions for the day.
Great, I love your research, I love your presentation, thank you. But you left me with a big question, like, what is the first word of your title mean?
Oh, thank you, sorry. Yeah, when something is stochastic, it means it's not going in a way we can predict. There's a lot of noise. So like when you turn on the television and it's all the black and white sparkle noise, that's what stochasticity means in an ecology sense. And so there's been, and thank you, sorry, I've already taught a class today, and so by the time I get here, I'm partially missing things. So I wanted to start with this. There's a centuries-long debate in ecology, which is like, are communities predictable and successional? Is there a climax state? Are they on a trajectory? Or is it just like this random assemblage mess? And I think the answer is a lot of times, time really matters, right? Like who shows up when really matters. And hopefully I've convinced you of that at least a little bit. But it doesn't just have to be a mess and it doesn't just have to be noise. We can predict where and why and how and when those things are likely to matter. Yeah, thanks for asking. Yeah.
What advice do you have for managers when you have a huge hundreds of acres project like the Elwha? It takes years of planning ahead of time before doing it.
Absolutely.
Do you then cross your fingers that when you plant, it's a good year?
Great question. And the dam removal one is tricky because one of the things that we found on the Elwha was that that timing really matters. Right. And this was conversations between myself and Josh as well, was like, oh, if you could hit the cottonwood timing, you'd be golden. They don't choose drawdown timing based on what the plant people want. Maybe someday somebody will do a dam removal when they do, but it's entirely based on what's the sediment impact in the river, what's the impact on fish, if anybody's using that water downstream, what's the impact on them. So you kind of got to work with what you have. But I would say one of the big things is that, you know, hedging your bets, right? If there's a way to start things in multiple years, which they're definitely doing here on the Klamath, they seeded stuff last year, they held back seed, they're seeding stuff this year. Then you give yourself 2 shots at it. And again, like if some native species take last year and some native species take this year, then you've got a more diverse assemblage overall than just the one or the and so I think a lot for managers, it's like, how do you optimize that variation? How do you take advantage of that variation to improve that diversity? Because diverse systems are resilient systems. But yes, we can't mess with the weather. So that is a trick.
Wondering, for your seeding processes, the restoration, what are the sources of your seeds and the process of planting the seeds and establishing the seeds?
Yeah, great question. Sure. Yeah, the question was, what are the sources of the seeds and the processes of planting the seeds? The projects I showed you were experimental ones. And so usually for that, we're buying native seed from a local nursery, ideally for locally sourced seed lots. And we're collecting the non-native seed ourselves because nobody's selling invasive species seed, but you can get it on the roadside. But I think like as a bigger question, that's really important. And there's been a lot of papers on that of like, what should local be like? What does the one I can speak to is the Klamath project. They only use like collected just straight from the wild or 1 year generation planted out seed. Because one of the issues is if you take a native species and you grow it for 3 generations, you can, in a beautiful irrigated perfect pasture, you can end up selecting for traits that aren't necessarily going to be adapted to, hey, we threw it out in this bright sunny space and wished it luck. And so I know there's been a lot of push both locally and nationally on thinking a lot better about seed for restoration, and it's hugely important.
Process, or how are you placing the seed? How are you establishing the seed?
Sure. For these experiments, it's usually met like we're weighing it out, we're mixing them, we're weighing it to make sure every plot gets the same amount. And then it's hand scattered and maybe raked over to assure contact with the soil, usually timing right before we think rains are coming. That works when you've got small plots. Again, I can just speak to the Klamath. Some of those areas are being hand seeded, walked and seeded from seed bags and seed mixes. Certain things are being planted either as plugs or acorns. And then there are also areas where they helicopter seeded because the soil was so fine, it was so muddy that people couldn't safely get out onto it. And so the places they couldn't reach, it was like, well, now what do you do? And so they helicopter seeded, and that was like, let's go buy bulk some native species, but you know, native in the bigger sense as opposed to the hyper locally collected, right? Buy some cheap seeds, stick in a helicopter, get something out there. I now know there are also spots out there where they're going out with the like BLM style big drum tiller seeders as well. So on a project that size, I think the answer is all of the above where you need it. Yeah. Great question.
Just curious, if we could share anything about, kind of what the influence on the cultural human impact is on the succession, because I think it would be important, especially in the chaparral and in fires and so on. When we were, we're surrounded by habitat, right? It's dependent on fire, and at least it's this year's fire seems to be one of the least harmful disturbances we get about native wildlife migration. Shrubs that come back, but some probably most intensive disturbances that I see are the put up log in a private land where nothing's really being done afterwards, and those are the places where obviously you see native or non-native pollen and stuff, all that stuff coming in. So, you know, I think there's this idea sometimes that if it's in a remote area, eventually the native plants are gonna come back, but I see areas that are still 10, 15 years up the road, and the dominant species still are these black, small, things like that, right? So I was curious if, just if you could share anything on that. The timing of that, I assume just as soon as possible, the sooner the better, that humans are leaving.
Yeah. So to a little bit summarize for people on Zoom, and if I'm understanding your question right, was that difference between like a natural disturbance like fire versus like a human driven disturbance like logging, and how invasive species and species dynamics and timing might matter across those kinds of disturbances? Is that a acceptable short summary? Yeah.
Well, the Nami is also some of the first, the first one we were in, which one on the road, again, in the end, we still have a foreign.
Yeah, absolutely. I have not yet explicitly started a post-logging system, so I will caveat with that. But yes, I mean, the things that fire does to an area are very different than the things that logging does to an area, right? It's not just the removal of woody species. There are species in our area, there's species throughout California that only germinate when their seeds are hot. And there's species that only germinate when they're exposed to the chemicals in smoke or charcoal. They're like, seeds are crazy cool, and some of those chemical responses are crazy cool. And so those seeds could be sitting in the soil in a logged area and they'll never come up. There are other species that come up because there's enough sunlight, or there's enough space, or there's enough water, and so those might pop up post-logging. A lot of the invasive species that you're speaking to, you know, a lot of them are opportunist. So if you don't have a lot of native species, you'll get them. But a lot of them are also brought in by heavy machinery. And so whether the disturbance is logging or fire, you know, if you have a fire where there's a whole bunch of engines working on it, you could end up with a lot of those same non-natives because they're coming in on the machinery. Those are things that people are working on. I know somebody whose full-time job is hosing off fire equipment before it goes across the state line to try to stop the spread of that. That doesn't mean it's perfect all the time. Michael took me out to a place where they had staged machines that came up from California to fight one of the fires in the monument years ago. And where those machines were staged is where Dyer's Woad has spread and taken over, and we were just like pulling up a bag of it for fun. So sometimes it's vectors, and sometimes it's conditions. And so when you're logging, you're removing the biomass, but you're not necessarily then rejuvenating the soil. Fire's removing that biomass, but it actually makes nutrients available in a different way. It changes up the soil and it stimulates germination or resprouting of a lot of things. And so yeah, so yes, you absolutely get different patterns in invasives. Most things that are successfully invasive, even though that's a weird phrase, things that are really, really good at showing up somewhere new and taking over, are not early successional facilitative species that make things nice for other things, right? They hold a lot of space. They have really toxic litter. They have allelopathic effects on the soil, right? Like there's some reason that we call these invasive species, and it's usually because they're really good at keeping other things out. So while they may slow erosion, and that can actually reduce, you know, sediment impacts in the stream and things like that, you're not necessarily then expecting them to go away on their own. Yeah, because if they get there first, right? So I think that's your timing, is like fires often prioritize native species getting there first. Except for cases where they don't. So then they could be a foothold for non-natives. Whereas like logging is not necessarily giving those natives a head start. And if they're there first, then they have the advantage.
I was just curious if looking at suggestions of recovery as far as like with human time.
Yeah.
It seems like the faster we get there, it's the longer the way, the harder it gets to perform the.
Sometimes. Yeah, sometimes. Yeah.
I was on Klamath, I think it was. And it seemed like the banks were largely basins.
Where the road is, above where the lake itself was, is very invasive dominated. The matrix is very invasive dominated. So a lot of what you're probably looking at as banks was not actually the brand new, but what was there last year or the year before. And it's full of invasive species. So there's Medusa head, there's goat grass, there's star thistle, there's blackberry, there's I'm blinking, teasel, that, like, you name it, it's out there. And so that's, I think, again, where the Klamath project differs from the Elwha. In the Elwha, you're doing invasive treatments so that they don't get a hold in this new space. In the Klamath, you're trying to say, how much native can we get down, how fast to hold the space and give them a fighting chance. I know the Yurok tribe was treating in many places like a 50-foot buffer. But again, the Klamath reservoirs all told are 2,000 acres, over 2,000 acres. And so the surrounding matrix is much, much more than that. So you can't treat that all when it's that heavily invaded, unfortunately. Not without larger scale use of fire than Siskiyou County is currently prepared to support. And even then, it's still a challenge for some of those species. And so it was really targeted treatments of where the places that we think would likely to be moving invasives best into the reservoir and how do we hit those. But most of them, the easily accessible area that was hand seeded, our data says that's predominantly native and mostly the species that were seeded. The middle of the reservoirs got really weird because it's like all these like semi-aquatic plants that happened to either be in the water column or float down. People loved them because they were like, it's bright green and lush, but it's like water pepper and things that are bright green and lush, are mostly not native, but there were some natives as well, and are probably not going to show up next year anyway, because they only germinate when it's really, really wet, and it won't be really, really wet next year. So that actually would be a case where I'd say we don't worry about those invasives because we just assume they're contributing organic matter. It could.
Shading and all of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think they'll stick around for the shading. I think they were pretty dead by August. But yeah, and a lot of those are the places where they then actually brought in the heavy machinery and tilled, for better or worse, see. So yeah.
I was really glad to see your work on the meadows and the conifer encroachment.
Yeah.
My work is with butterflies, and the caterpillar food host plants are typically early succession.
Mm-hmm.
So the resetting of the succession is typically really welcome.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, those meadows also have a lot of very cool butterflies. It's a fun spot.
So where are the sites in Siskiyou County?
These ones?
Yeah.
This is so Scott River Watershed Council is based in Etna. And then kind of in between or past Etna is Callahan. In between Callahan and Gazelle is a turnoff for the road that goes up to Kangaroo Lake.
Yeah.
And these are the
That's where the
two.
bends are.
These
That's
are-
where the
yeah.
dark zone is.
Well, so Kangaroo Lake's got a mini watershed, and then the two watersheds over from that also have a lot of Darlingtonia fence. So Rock Fence Meadows and Cabin Creek Meadows, or Cabin Meadows Creek Meadows. They named that one a little weird. That's where these ones are, and they've actually got tons of Darlingtonia. They're really gorgeous, and there's just not there's not camping there. It's not like I don't know. It hasn't gotten a lot of attention, I think, as this biological hotspot. I've read Forest Service surveys from the 90s where they talk about how cool the Darlingtonia is and how the cattle are eating all of them. And we showed up there 2 years ago and it was like the Darlingtonia is really cool and there's still all the cattle. So maybe they're more resilient than we think, or maybe this has just been an ongoing problem. A little both, but it's a beautiful site. I love it. And it's public land, it's open access. So definitely go see. Yeah.
Up on the Siskiyou Trinity County line.
Yeah. Yeah, well,
So we have 3 questions online. I don't know if you want to read them from your screen or I can read them.
sure. All right, I'm finding 2 of them, but maybe then you can read me.
There's one that said, what is,
Oh, the axis of the graph. Okay, I kind of skimmed over that because I didn't want to bog you down in statistics, but it's one of the ways when we have a really complex data set. So in this case, like we've got 60 different species and we can't plot every 6 species as an axis because our brains don't think in 60-dimensional space. And so we're taking all of those components of variation and smushing them down to 2 so that we can visualize which communities are more different from each other and which communities are more similar. So the ones further away are more different and the ones closer together are more similar. And I can go back to that slide. Oh, maybe not. Back. So PCOA stands for principal component of variation or principal component analysis. But everything that's more spread out is more different from each other, and everything that's close together is more similar. And so, not surprisingly, the plots where we planted perennials are different from the plots where we planted annuals. But the annual ones are all more similar to each other than the perennial ones are to each other. And if you just look at 1 year of planting, you don't get that pattern. But when you look across the 5 years of planting, you do.
And the data is all species abundance, nothing else.
Yeah. Yeah, so species cover, you can do this with species cover, you can do it with biomass. You can sometimes do it with species presence absence, but it doesn't tend to go as well. Yeah. And then we've got a question. How is my work being used to inform SER's principles and standards for restoration? I don't know that it is at that scale. I tend to work. I share my work and publish my work and discuss my work, but I also tend to discuss it and collaborate with like local practitioners on a particular project. So I've spent a lot of time talking to people who are restoring California grasslands or planting stipa about all of the different things that we found across different projects. I collaborate very closely with folks doing work here on the Klamath and the Scott River, but it tends to be more on that scale than like international standards for restoration. And then the other question was on seed provenance, which was I think I asked already. Anything else I missed in the chat?
No, I have a question. So, is there any like subsurface kind of discussion here? Because it seems like everything's surface related. So is there like mycelium or anything that else is cataloged? That was one of the questions. And then root depth, is that something that plays into the propagation of some of these plants throughout time? And like the lupin, is that something that allows it to be more successful because it has potentially the root depth is allowed to get to the current water table or something of that nature?
Yeah, great questions. Ones that go into whole other fields, most of which I draw on and learn from, but don't mess with myself. So lupin, for example, the way that lupin is a nitrogen fixer is through mutualistic relationships with fungi that are doing the nitrogen fixing. That's true for most of our nitrogen fixing plants.
Bacteria.
Bacteria.
Thank you for thinking highly of fungi, but they don't matter.
Thank you. Sorry, it's late. I've been here for 12 hours today, so you're getting the end of what my brain is left. For the rooting depth component, yeah, in a lot of ways. So like the way that stipa is a perennial grass and the way that it becomes this old growth 100-year-old perennial grass is because it has very deep roots and very robust roots. And so it goes dormant during the summer when it's dry, and it comes back up again in spring. And so it's living below ground. The shrub species that I was working with, as well as the talk I didn't get on, which was about shrubs and chaparral response to fire. A lot of those resprout. They resprout in different ways. And that all has to do with below ground storage. And so that we're there where we're looking at fire and drought. One of the questions was like, if you have a drought and you've used up some of your below ground storage to get through that drought, and then the fire hits, what's left, and how well are those shrubs able to respond post fire when they've already been impacted by that drought? And are those similar patterns to if you have two fires with relatively short frequency, or in what ways are they different? So I think about a lot of those things. I work with people who actually like dig out roots and measure depths and image things and all of that. I've done it once for some seedlings and it was fun. But it's not usually what I spend my time doing. Yeah, but obviously, yeah, big important impacts in the system. Okay, thanks for having me.